from that aircraft any minute now, and then heading straight to the Prime Minister's residence in the national capital for that all-important bilateral. If you take a look at the agenda that is possibly going to be discussed as far as that meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi is concerned, we do see that there is going to be some sort of a progress on a number of issues, especially the jet engine deal, the procurement of Predator drones, also on 5G and 6G spectrum and collaboration of critical and emerging technologies, and also the progress in the civil nuclear areas. This was, remember, also mentioned by the National Security Advisor of the United States, Mr. Jake Sullivan. And we're taking cues from all of that statement that's coming in. Any minute, we will see President Joe Biden getting down from the aircraft. We're constantly playing those live visuals for you as Air Force One has touched down in the national capital. And I'm leaving you at that with these very visuals. We're waiting for US President Joe Biden to get down from the aircraft. It's over to my colleague Shivani Gupta, who is going to carry forward with Plain Speak up next.
Welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for staying with us. You're watching Plain Speak with me, Shivani Gupta. India is all set for this G20 Leaders Summit 2023. And what a show the country has put up. Joe Biden, US President, has just landed, as the visuals on your screen show. We're of course on standby for the President of the United States to make an exit from the aircraft. And of course, he'll be heading straight to the Prime Minister's residence for his bilateral with the Indian Prime Minister. The centerpiece of the G20 Bharat Mandapam is abuzz with a lot of activity all through the day today, as it will be for the next 2 days, with all of these global leaders touching down. The Prime Minister, as I said, is set to host a number of bilaterals, including the very important one with his US counterpart. From over 200 programs in over 60 cities of the country, this G20 presidency has been called the People's Presidency by the government. And by now, it will culminate in the national capital, and the city is all decked up. But more importantly, everything is functioning according to a plan. It is working like clockwork. Dignitaries are being wowed, and India's image is being boosted in the eyes of the world. From the tagline of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam to the 8.5-meter statue of Nataraj, the cosmic dancer form of Lord Shiva, at the entrance of the G20 Summit venue, this is also about showcasing India's roots. The manner in which the presidency was celebrated and implemented all across the country makes this a G20 presidency akin to a festival for India. So has the government really managed to put up the greatest international show ever in the country? We'll of course get a lot of our guests to respond to that, but let's keep our focus on these visuals that are coming in from the national capital. Air Force One carrying the US Prime Minister Joe Biden touching down in the national capital. Let me also go across to my colleagues Abhishek Jha and Siddhant, who've been tracking a lot of the G20 activity. Abhishek, coming to you first up. Lots on the agenda for the premiers of US and India as they get set for a bilateral in just about an hour's time from now. And this is going to be a continuation of the friendship that was strengthened during the Prime Minister's visit to the US last.
Of course, and in as many as last 4 months, I think this is the third time that the two leaders will be having a bilateral conversation. Prime Minister Modi had a chance to meet him in Japan during G7 Summit level talks. Then the Prime Minister had traveled to White House, where he was invited as a state guest, an official state guest, and the Biden family has invited him over dinner in White House. And now President Biden himself is in Delhi, where he will be having most likely the meeting a few minutes from now, because 7:45 p.m. is likely the time when the two leaders will be meeting and discussing the bilateral ties, and where they had whatever they had discussed during the June summit level talks, how to progress with that. We have seen India-US bilateral ties in all encompassing in the areas from strategic ties to defense sector, to climate change, people-to-people engagement, education policies, collaboration in research and technology, space collaboration, cyber security, critical and emerging technologies. And we have seen multiple visits also from both sides happening. We have seen NSA Doval traveling to USA, US National Secretary Advisor, he is traveling back to India. And there have been 2+2, joint talk, strategic level dialogue also, where the Foreign Minister of India and Defense Minister of India joins their US counterpart in discussing how India-US collaboration can achieve its goal in strategic areas. So there is a deep, trusted ties where both countries are looking for a long roadmap ahead.
Absolutely.
And this visit of Biden will cement
And the US
that long
administration
vision of
has
the two countries.
absolutely focused on that. Ahead of the the president's, touching down in the national capital, the US administration of Joe Biden has made it very clear that, this is a very important partnership for them. This has always been a long-term strategic partnership for them, but based on common values. And this is something that will be the focus for the US president as he comes to the national capital, even though he's, of course, coming for the G20 heads of state meeting. Let me also go across to Siddhant. Siddhant, the city, you've been tracking it, has been geared up and is functioning beautifully as all of these big heads of state arrive in the capital, and possibly the biggest of them is now touching down.
That's right, Shivani. In fact, behind me you can see this magnificent Bharat Mandapam, and this entire arena complex is decked up, full of lights, colors, laser shows happening. And behind me, I cannot establish that from my camera for our viewers, but the rehearsals are also going on, that how the convoys of heads of states will enter the premises and how they will depart from the premises. So the rehearsals were going on just a short while back. But coming back to the arrival of President Biden, as Abhishek pointed out, that this would be the third time that both leaders will be holding bilateral talks in 3 months. They met on the sidelines of G7 in Hiroshima, then in DC, and now in India. And straight after landing, President Biden is going to go to 7 LKM, where both leaders will meet. So also, usually, Shivani, you also know that whenever there is some state visit or official visit, these meetings are located or perhaps take place at Hyderabad House. This is perhaps for the first time that it is going to take place at 7 LKM. So there could be some sort of a messaging, or Prime Minister maybe trying to give a personal touch to these leaders, as it's a big moment for India, as India is hosting G20. So this bilateral meeting will take place at Prime Minister's official residence, 7 LKM, and it will start at around 8:20, between 8:20 to 8:30.
Yes.
And there could be discussion on a lot of areas. Less big ticket announcements. There would be more focus would be more on fast tracking the announcements which
that
were
have
made in
already
June,
been made,
and
absolutely.
also to review some of the long-standing projects.
Yes, absolutely. One of those is, of course, nuclear reactors construction deal that has to be sealed. I do thank both Abhishek and Siddhant for joining us. Let me also go across to our guest joining us. Meera Shankar is former Indian ambassador to the US. Daniel S. Markey is author and senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Professor Max Abrams, international security expert from Boston, is joining us, and also Professor Madhav Nalapad. Meera Shankar, I'm coming to you first up. Just the statements that have been made by the US administration, as I mentioned earlier, ahead of the arrival of the president in India, just goes on to show the kind of emphasis the US administration is putting in its relationship with India, which was also witnessed when the Prime Minister visited last.
Yes, I think the India-US strategic partnership has definitely intensified and acquired more substance as there is increasing strategic convergence between the two countries with regard to establishing a stable and sustainable balance in Asia, which is not under the dominance of any one country. Beyond this, of course, there are major interests which both countries have in each other: economic, technological, and in the area of scientific cooperation. So there's a whole big agenda which the two countries have, and it's a relationship which is becoming more substantive. This is reflected in the frequency of exchanges, and of course the meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi in Delhi will ensure that the momentum in the relationship, which was built up after the state visit of Prime Minister Modi to Washington, is sustained, and that many of the significant decisions which were taken there are followed up and implemented within a time frame. Because, we've seen this in the past, that there are big decisions and then, they tend to fall by the wayside if they are not pursued emphatically by both sides. So the GEF 414 engine, for instance, the joint venture to produce it in India with HAL, where is the agreement between HAL and GE? Yes, now there is US congressional approval for it. So that's a step forward. What is the time frame that GE has for establishing the factory? What is the time frame that HAL has for completing the design of the aircraft? The drones, where the price negotiations were to be completed, the Reaper drones, which India wanted to buy. Then the whole critical and emerging technologies initiative, the first step with regard to investment in some aspects of semiconductors in India, but the broader question of creating an eco framework or a framework for connecting business, universities, research institutions in these high-tech areas of semiconductors, artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunication and beyond, and space, as well as other areas.
And so there are a little bit there are this people's issues connected to the people's day-to-day lives as well that are on agenda. For example, review of consulates, progress in Ahmedabad and Bengaluru, the relaxation in visa norms that is to be reviewed, the push for fast tracking of, as you said, the GE jet engines deal, cooperation in semiconductor supply chains, enhancing commercial collaborations, and as I mentioned, nuclear reactors construction deal to be sealed as well. Max, I want to come to you. Just give me a sense of how important the US establishment is looking at India to play the role that it needs, of course, in a fractured world, in a divided world, and for a lot of that to be achieved during this G20 summit in the national capital.
The U.S. regards India as a critical strategic partner. There are obvious reasons for this. The United States is always looking for markets and for trade, and India has now overtaken China as the most populous country. Also, its growth rate demographically is rising, whereas other countries are falling. India is currently ranked as the 7th largest economy in the world. And again, the Indian economy is moving up, whereas other economies, including China, seems to be struggling much more. By 2030, India is projected to have the 3rd largest economy up there.
Max, just interrupting you for a brief minute. President Joe Biden is now walking down the stairs of the Air Force One. The president is being received by VK Singh as a representative of the Indian government. But there are, of course, the US ambassador to India who's also there at the airport. You see, I think that's J.V. Shergill who's also there. No, that's somebody else. But VK Singh is obviously there as a representative of the Indian government, welcoming the US president to India. The US ambassador to India, the new one, who has obviously just started a few months ago, is also there at the airport. This is going to be a brief introductions and a few statements exchanged at the New Delhi airport before the president gets into what is referred to as the Beast, his vehicle, and goes to 7 LKM for that bilateral with the Indian Prime Minister. The president also meeting a young girl there. They seem to know each other from before. And yes, so pleasantries being exchanged. The President of the United States has landed in the national capital. This is, of course, ahead of G20 Summit. But there is a bilateral to look forward to that's happening just this evening in just about an hour's time from now. Yes, Max, sorry to interrupt you there. You can finish your thought.
Yes, so, the United States is really prioritizing this relationship for all sorts of reasons. Economically, yes, but of course, this relationship is happening in the shadow of growing American concerns that so-called unipolarity, post-Cold War, the condition where the United States was seen as the world's premier hegemonic power is obviously, contested and challenged. There's an obvious rise of China. We've been expecting this for a long time, but it really, over the past decade, has come to fruition. The United States views India as a bulwark against China. So for all of these reasons, economic, but also military, the US-India relationship is extraordinarily important. I think it's interesting that Xi is not present at this summit. And I think that the Americans are going to try to exploit this and try to show not just India, but also the global South, the rest of the international community, that they should side more with the United States than with China. I think that Xi's omission from this summit is a very important aspect of it, and the United States is going to try to exploit it.
Yes. Well, it's not just Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, who's not going to be present. The Chinese premier is in town. But it's also, of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin, who's not coming for the G20 summit either. And precisely what Max has been talking about, there's this growing discomfort between the West Bloc and China and Russia together. We will talk about that in just a bit. But Daniel, I want to come to you with that question. In fact, the absence of Russia and Chinese president, is that going to take away too much from the G20 summit? Or do you feel that this is something that was expected, is on expected lines, and it shouldn't deter the rest of the countries to make the best out of this summit?
Well, obviously, the other countries have agendas that they'll want to advance. And to some extent, I don't think that the absence of either of these countries' leaders would necessarily preclude that. I do think we should separate the two. The absence of Putin was something that was widely anticipated. We all know that this was gearing up to be already a divisive summit as a consequence of Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the differences of opinion over that. And Putin's position in all of that made his attendance very difficult, if not impossible. And so that was fully expected. But Xi's decision not to come, which has not been fully explained publicly to the world, and was not really previewed up until the last few days, is a surprise. I think it was at least in part intended to be a snub to India. Whether or not it will land that way is a different issue. And precisely why she has chosen not to come is also not entirely clear. It may have domestic or other reasons behind it, so we simply don't know at this point. It will, I think, make India's life in some ways a little bit easier because bridging the gap between the positions of Russia and China versus the so-called West and the global South, India will, have to have a little bit less of a bridging act to play. But we should remember that the Chinese delegation will be there, even if she won't be there.
Yes.
The rest will be there, and they can still try to obstruct progress, particularly on the Ukraine issue, on a joint statement, and a variety of other things. So it doesn't eliminate the challenge, but some of the photographs were bound to be uncomfortable had she been there, and some of that will be made a bit easier.
In fact, on the joint statement, I want to go across to Madhav, Professor Madhav as well. That's the one big thing that everybody is watching out for. It's expected on Sunday at the end of the summit meet, but it could be in doldrums. It is in doubt, given that we've not had that statement being agreed upon by all nations. The Ukraine-Russia war is casting a very wide shadow on any kind of a joint statement. Do you believe that any kind of a New Delhi statement is possible at all?
Look, I'd like to say very clearly that we have to look at it from the point of view of how democracies look at things. As far as India and the United States are concerned, long before there were close government-to-government relations, there were close people-to-people relations. And there's a very vibrant Indian-American community that has contributed a lot to that. There are tens of millions of people in India who have extensive linkages to the United States. So it's a relationship that has grown from the ground up. It's not been imposed from the top down. President Biden sent one of his closest personal friends, Ambassador Garcetti, as the envoy to India. He did that because Ambassador Garcetti has a direct line to President Biden. And he did that as a mark of his understanding that India is a critical partner in the Indo-Pacific. We're talking about defense. The reality is that U.S. Defense companies will need to base a lot of their plans and production in India if they are to compete in the global market with what is likely to be a coming together of Russian and Chinese defense technologies. So that is a very, very important aspect in which both sides will benefit. Technology. You look at all the major technology centers in the United States. I've gone to some of them. And believe me, sometimes I believe I'm back in India. You hardly see anyone who is not ethnically Indian. Of course, they're all American, but they're all ethnically Indian. So the reality is these two democracies are finally coming together at the top. And may I say that as soon as Prime Minister Modi came, all the four agreements that basically are the foundation for India-US defense and security cooperation were signed under Prime Minister Modi. India has joined the Quad. And let's not kid ourselves. When we are talking about a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, it means we are protecting the Indo-Pacific from powers that don't want a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific.
Okay.
So from all points of view, the two biggest democracies coming together, the leaders of the two having a nice dinner at the home of the Indian Prime Minister, whereas previously it was the home of the US President. I think it's very meaningful, not just in terms of a statement. This is a statement. And in my view, as a common citizen, not as a experienced, if I may say so, civil servant or bureaucrat, I'd like to say that for me, this is what counts.
Okay, all right. Well, there's a lot of business that is done on the sidelines of a summit like this. Yes, it is about diplomacy, it is about that statement, it is about bridging some of the divides in the world and showcasing your heft as a host, which India is doing. But on the sidelines, a lot of business takes place. I request our guest to stay with us. Here's a conversation with the US-India Business Council President Atul Keshab on the G20 Summit that I had earlier and what it means for India and the partnerships on the business front. Listen in. The G20 with India as the president, Mr. Keshab, you know it's a big occasion for us. President Biden is coming. Leaders from across the world, global community are coming. How do you see this moment for India?
Shivani, thank you for having me. Look, this is India's golden moment. India will shine on the world stage. The leaders of the top 20 economies will come here. President Biden is coming here. India's had a magnificent, magical moment with the Chandrayaan-3 landing on the south pole of the moon.
Yes.
An incredibly difficult feat to achieve, a victory for all of India and all of humanity. What ISRO has done, I think, kind of hammers the ball out of the park on the notion that India's moment has come, and that this is a golden time for Indians to aspire for the greatest amount of national economic growth and happiness and prosperity and development as India rises to become a much, much bigger economy and to help set the standards and the rules for the world of the 21st century.
The G20, of course, focuses a lot on the politics, diplomacy, because a lot of the global leaders will be there on the same forum. But a lot of the work actually gets done behind the scenes, things like you do. So give me a sense of business-wise, trade, investment, collaboration-wise, what is it that you're focusing on while being in the national capital?
So that's a great question. Look, I represent a business council of over 200 world-class companies, American and Indian. And if you look at, for instance, the joint statement set by President Biden and Prime Minister Modi after the state visit, there are 58 paragraphs in there. And these paragraphs reflect the very bold aspirations of the two governments for where they see U.S. and Indian collaboration in kind of ensuring the happiness, freedom, and prosperity of our people and of the entire world. But in a lot of that, business plays a really key role in defense, in pharmaceuticals and life sciences, in future tech and deep tech, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, in cybersecurity, in space exploration. Our companies increasingly are collaborating in many ways that will help define how much government can achieve. So my job as the head of a trade association is to try to find ways that we can smooth out the path of US-India business-to-business collaboration in a way that we can help the governments achieve these very, very bold goals. Because if India and America succeed, it's going to be good for the entire planet.
Yes, and we remember when the Prime Minister was in US on that trip, which has really shifted the Indo-US ties to a new level. A lot of the focus was on business. You had business leaders around the two world leaders, and of course, all of that needs to be taken forward. You spoke about the Chandrayaan. Space tech is growing. Is there anything we can expect or look forward to as far as companies or collaborations are concerned in this field?
So you have seen how there has been an enormous growth in private sector space explorations, near Earth, remote sensing, and so many other applications besides in the United States since we deregulated the space sector. And so you've got companies that are launching rockets, they're supplying the space station, they're putting astronauts up. And I think that that kind of growth is really unlocking the potential of space.
Well, why is the world looking at India when it comes to strengthening their business ties? That's because India's the fastest growing emerging economy in the world. And really, the only single bright spot, if we can say, is for such a large country around the world economically. Let's also take a look at what the World Bank has said as far as India's growth is concerned in the last few years. So the World Bank's G20 document says that India has achieved financial inclusion in record time. They've talked about how in 6 years alone, the financial inclusion has been taken to a level of 80%. Of course, this is something we've discussed very much in domestic politics. In 2022, the value of the UPI transactions became nearly 50% of India's nominal GDP. Without digital infrastructure, this would have taken 47 years to reach the current stage. The Indian digital payment infrastructure includes, of course, the landmark schemes of the Prime Minister like Jan Dhan bank accounts, Aadhaar, of course mobile phones, the fact that internet is the cheapest anywhere in the world in India. The cost of onboarding customers has decreased from $23 to just $0.1 because of the digital payment infrastructure mechanisms. Also in March 2022, the World Bank report talks about how India's savings were at $33 billion, equivalent to nearly 1.14 of the GDP. And these are words that have not just come from the World Bank. Not so long ago, the IMF had also lauded India's advancements in the digital infrastructure field and more. In fact, the IMF chief lauded India's leadership ahead of the G20 Summit, saying that the country has set a high bar for global leadership and that India's presidency is helping the fragmented world. She also couldn't help herself from participating in an Odia folk dance upon her arrival. Here are those visuals. Madhav, I want to come to you once again on, the soft power that India is displaying as far as this G20 summit is concerned. They've really taken it to the public in the run-up to the New Delhi Heads of State meeting to over 200 cities. They're showcasing India's roots, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, plus the large Nataraj statue. You've got folk dances taking place, Indian music, Indian architecture, Indian history on display. Your thoughts on how the government has handled and presented this G20 presidency?
Look, the first point is that in India, for a long time, an international meeting was basically Delhi, perhaps Mumbai, okay, Bangalore as well, possibly, but that's about it. Maybe at most half a dozen cities. Today we are talking about 50 to 60 cities, and we are talking especially even in small towns. And I have long said that the future of India, the future of technology in India is going to be in the small towns because the quality of life is so much better in a small town and techies will be drawn there. So the fact is that this is a whole of India approach. It's not just the metro India, it's a whole of India approach. And may I point out one important point which India is raising, which the Prime Minister has been talking about, and that is a global kind of a framework for crypto. The reality is crypto is something that you can't avoid. I mean, there are some central banks and central bankers who basically are happy about it and who would like to ban it. or block it. It can't be blocked. In fact, you should use blockchain and make it transparent. The Prime Minister is instead saying you have to have global norms and you have to have it transparent so that people can understand what is happening in the world of crypto,
Okay.
that dark web and criminal gangs, mafiosi, terrorists do not use cryptocurrency the way they use cash currency. So that is a very important point that India is making. And I do hope that the other G20 members will sign on to a global kind of a framework
For
to ensure
cryptocurrency. Okay.
does not go into the dark actions of terrorists and others.
Daniel, I want to take your thoughts as well as a foreign observer. What do you make of the message that India is trying to send of its, large history, culture, the message of one earth, one family, one future? On climate issues, for example, the Prime Minister has led from the front. India is leading the charge despite being a developing country on meeting climate goals. The Prime Minister recently spoke to moneycontrol.com, which is our sister concern, highlighting those on how India wants to do more. He recently also talked about how these goals have to be met, they have to be increased. That is the legacy that the G20 summit or the government wants to leave with this G20 summit, exposing more of India's culture, civilization to the world and what it stands for.
Yeah, I'd say India is doing a very good job of presenting itself as an attractive partner to a wide range of other countries, certainly including the United States. And I think that this is urgent as a sort of a strategic agenda for India. This isn't just a matter of nice to have, a friendly face to the world. This is a critical opportunity that India actually not just would be good to seize, but needs to seize in order to see an expansion of employment for its many young people and to see it achieve the kind of economic growth and development that is really necessary for India to assume the position that it would like to assume on the world stage as not just a leading power, but one of the very most powerful countries in the world.
Right.
If India doesn't seize this moment and do so in a way that attracts foreign capital and all kinds of investment and all kinds of new business arrangements, then it'll be a big missed opportunity. And that would be problematic for India. So it's not just a matter of this is India's moment and India is coming out to the world, but India needs to do this for its own purposes. And so far, so good in a number of different ways. But the proof will be in the eating over the next coming years.
Right.
This isn't just one big splashy event and you're done.
No, absolutely. In fact, the Prime Minister recently has reiterated a couple of messages, which is that this is the moment for India to seize. This presidency is happening for us at the right time so that we can showcase our strengths and what we stand for. But of course, the next 25 years, as the government calls Amrit Kal, till 2047, when we are hoping to become a developed country, if we don't seize the moment now, then it will be a missed opportunity, as you said. I request our guests to stay with us. Let's also take a quick look at just what is on showcase. Now, that Bharat Mandapam that has been created by India is already wowing not just local residents or Indians, but the foreign dignitaries. Here's none other than the G20 India Chief Coordinator, Harsh Shringla, giving you a tour of the delegates' offices as well. Take a look. Welcome back. Let's also talk about the Global South. What is now attained through the G20 presidency is an inclusion of the Global South into the priority setting of this grouping. Through the Voice of the Global South virtual summit in January 2023, India consulted as many as 125 countries that are normally left out of the process. Besides, countries from the Global South also dominate the list of guests that India has invited for this New Delhi summit, thus bringing the priorities of the Global South and becoming their main articulator is a major achievement of India's presidency. But what is the Global South? The Global South refers to countries often characterized as developing, less developed or underdeveloped, primarily located in Africa, Asia and Latin America. Today, in the bilateral meet with the US President Joe Biden, the Prime Minister is likely to push to Washington to strengthen its support for the Global South. Let me also, for the benefit of our viewers, break down on the world map what exactly is the Global South. Well, as the name suggests, this is of course the continents that are southern and are often divided because the north is more developed, certainly North America versus Latin America. You've got of course the Europe continent, especially Western Europe. It includes of course countries like some of the countries like Ukraine and others. And then of course this green zone minus Japan, minus Asia, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, the other developed countries. This green zone including India, China, you've got Middle East, Africa, Latin America. This is what is referred to as the Global South. Basically countries that are still developing and need more strength. And why is this Global South important? The Global South is important for many reasons. First of all, remember that these are countries which have large populations, as much as 85% of the global numbers. These are countries with rich cultures, history and a lot of natural resources. They also have a growing economic heft. They contribute more than half to the world's economic growth today. And by 2030, 3 of the world's largest economies will come from the Global South. These include, of course, India, China and Indonesia. Now, the intra-South trade is also accounting for over a quarter of global trade, which is also why this grouping is very important. The GDP in terms of purchasing power of the Global South BRICS nations has surpassed that of the Global North's G7 club. Now there are more billionaires in Beijing than in New York City. Now this bloc is also asserting itself politically on the global scene, and therefore a lot of these countries are coming together, with India really championing their cause for a global seat as far as these big events are concerned. So the PM in his recent interview to moneycontrol.com also highlighted the need for the Global South to be heard more. This is what he said. He said India's growth advances the interests of Global South. So of course, the fact that India does well helps this bloc as well. G20 Troika can amplify the voice of the Global South, which is why a lot of the invitees from India are countries from the Global South. Global South concerns raised at multilateral forums. We are the voice for inclusion of those who felt excluded. There are a lot of issues as far as the Global South are concerned. They haven't really been on the table so far. They haven't been heard. They've been excluded from the world's growth, and this is why they need more support. The Prime Minister also added should seek views outside the G20, especially from Global South, and this is a cause that the Prime Minister has been championing for quite some time. I also spoke to ORF President Samir Saran about how India can be the champion of the Global South, but can it also be a leading voice or a leader for the Global South? Here's more from that conversation. Let me talk to you about the Global South. We're hearing this term a lot more than we did in recent past. Why is the Global South so important? And again, can India be the leading voice of the Global South as it is seemingly positioning itself?
India can certainly be one of the important, loud and rational voices of the South that seeks architecture, a global governance architecture, a global political architecture that allows these countries to benefit from globalization like others have done in the past, to ensure that globalization remains available to these countries as others seem to be shutting the door, and to help shape policies that will benefit the specific needs of these geographies that don't necessarily seem to have been catered to by either the Western European or the American systems. So I think India should not position itself as a leader of the South. India should be a leading voice for the South. India should be a voice of innovation for the South, of building new development partnerships for the South, of changing the multilateral financial architecture that caters to the South. We must be the architect for a new South. Now, why is South so important for us today? It's precisely because the world seems to be reverting back to its, if I could use the word in a global context, its own tribal identity, the Western continental identity, regional identity. You know, the world seems to be retreating to that old format. So going back to the future in a sense, right? So India in this moment has to continue to ensure that in a 21st century context, can we continue to be the leaders of the third way, where we don't have to make choices, where we are able to do business with both, where we serve our people first, and we are not being fodder to the political cycles that these two different groupings are going to want us to be. So we don't want to be a feedstock for them and their politics. We want to make sure that we are able to feed, grow, and meet the aspirations of our people, and that has to be the reason why Global South is important.
Daniel and Madhav continue to be with us. So, Madhav, let me begin with you. Not possibly the leader of the Global South, but certainly a leading voice for the Global South. And that's a role that already under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we seem to be playing. Would you agree?
Well, I agree with that. And I'd only like to say that, in my view, China is certainly not a member of the Global South. China, from the point of view of its total economy and even its geographic position, is not really a member of the Global South. India very definitely is part of that. And that's the first point. And the second point is, Shivani, that the good news is that, we just now saw Joe Biden coming, and he is probably, reached the Prime Minister's house. Would you believe it? In the 1990s, for the 8 years of Bill Clinton, China was given every access it wanted to sophisticated technology by the United States and by United States partners. And guess which country was denied about 90% of that technology? And its own technology was thought to be smothered. You guessed it. It's the world's biggest democracy, India. That is the crazy illogic of geopolitics in the era of Cold War 1.0. And now things have changed. Now it is very clear to both sides. In India also, we have a lot of romanticists who have got some romantic views about, everybody can be together. I mean, all of us can be friends. Yes, all of us can be friends. The two sides want to be friends. But if the other side is looking only to harm you, well, it's going to be difficult for you to be a friend. So from that point of view, the big news, the big takeaway is Xi Jinping has stayed away because he's not interested in a discussion of the boundary issue. And frankly, the Prime Minister of China functions under the president. He has no authority to act on his own, and his entire portfolio is economic. So China would like to keep the focus on economics. But the reality is economics is also there. It rides on geopolitics and geopolitical fault lines. And that is something that this G20 is demonstrating. I'd like to again say that the fact that Xi Jinping has missed this summit, he is basically trying to insult the entire Global South, because this summit is about the Global South.
Okay. Speaking of the Global South, let me bring in Daniel as well. Daniel, there is, of course, you can argue whether China is part of this bloc. There is an ambiguity of whether Russia is part of this bloc or is part of the Global North. I'll leave that aside. But is the Western world or the Global North beginning to accept and acknowledge that the Global South needs to be given a bigger chair at the table?
I think to some extent, at the very least, the United States is appreciating that a lot of the competition in today's globalized world is happening in places that we describe as the Global South. And that competition is partially just between the United States and China, but it's in other ways as well. And so, from the U.S. perspective, there's if not an appreciation that all of the demands of the global South need to be met, I think a greater appreciation of the heft that they bring in terms of new and emerging markets, opportunities for investment and trade and so on. And that China, whether or not it's a part of the global South any longer, has made remarkable inroads in that part of the world and has, in various ways, provided a kind of leadership that the United States now sees as problematic. And India also sees that as problematic because it has its own aspirations for competition with China and its own aspirations for global leadership in the global South and beyond. And so there you see a convergence, I think, to a degree, of U.S. and Indian interests of providing alternatives to the global South, alternative models of development, alternative economic partners, alternative partners for the provision of technologies, including in financial technologies, where China, again, has made considerable inroads and has the potential, if it continues to basically win that competition in ways that would block out the active participation of other states. And that's something that certainly worries Washington. So, yeah, I don't think we've come to the point where we fully appreciate the global South and its demands, and there are problems with that. But we see it as a critically important place and partner for this competition with China.
Absolutely. Well, this is also a reminder of how the countries that have the best interests for all of the world need to come together to also be a bloc against the forces that are expansionist in nature and don't have the best interests of everybody at heart. I do thank Madhav and Daniel for joining us. Many thanks for your time. But as we talk about the Global South, or we talk about the G20 Summit, one of the big shadows on this summit is, of course, the absence of not just Russian President Vladimir Putin, but specifically the Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's not attending this summit. Will it have an impact on the stature of the G20 Summit that New Delhi is hosting? Once again, listen in to what President of ORF, one of the biggest think tanks in the country, Mr. Samir Saran, has to say. Speaking on the subject of China, both President Putin and President Xi Jinping are not coming, and Mr. Putin hasn't been traveling much, so I'll keep that aside. Will the absence of Xi Jinping in any way bring down the stature of this G20 summit and its conclusions?
Xi Jinping has also not been traveling. As you may have noticed, he's not gone to the ASEAN meeting as well. So he has skipped that meeting as well. He has troubles at home. Xi Jinping is a curious case. He always wants to be the big man in a room.
In the room, yeah.
At the G20, he's a small man in a very big room. It doesn't suit his style. He would rather go to a club of smaller countries where he would lord over them. He has the emperor syndrome, and he wants to always have a court with him as he travels.
Yeah.
Now, G20, no one is going to give him that kind of a treatment. And Xi Jinping, and certainly India is not going to give him that kind of a treatment, and which is good. So I think Xi Jinping, between his emperor syndrome and the fact that his country is in doldrums today. Even yesterday I was reading that there are likely to be far bigger bubbles that are going to be now witnessing a complete blowout in the coming few days, including some more real estate companies, some financial sector companies. We are seeing a meltdown in China. We are seeing youth unemployment. We now hear buzz, and it's very difficult to corroborate what really happens inside the Great Wall of China. But we are hearing that there is a disgruntled element within the party that is now they are beginning to raise their voice.
Yeah, so breathing down Xi Jinping's neck.
They're breathing down his neck. So Xi Jinping has trouble at home, and he's not necessarily the most appreciated man in the world today. I just started, that the world today is a ABC world, anybody but China world. That yes, they are playing with the small boys and they believe they have a great footprint in terms of number of countries. But in terms of global GDP, much of it is today suspicious of China. And that's a big difference compared to, say, 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. People believe post-pandemic China will come roaring back. But because Xi Jinping has destroyed the decision-making body within the Communist Party, which means the heterogeneity of views, the debate among elders. He has destroyed that format. Today there is one man thinking, and if he doesn't think too well, then the country is in trouble. And clearly Xi Jinping may not be the brightest man to lead China out of this mess that is of his own making. And I think he needs to spend time at home and look after his own affairs.
We also go back across to the national capital, the Delhi airport, where Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, his aircraft has landed, and he's also all set to get out of his aircraft. This is coming close on the heels, of course, of the US President Joe Biden landing just a short while ago. The US President is going to be holding a bilateral very soon. He's on his way to the Prime Minister's residence, 7 LKM. For that bilateral with the Indian Prime Minister. But we're waiting the arrival of the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has also landed in New Delhi. Now, as far as India and Canada are concerned, of course, friendly countries, but recently there has been some issues that have cropped up because of the entire Khalistani element connected to the community there. And, some of the moves or the noises that those Khalistani movement members have made in Canada, targeting either temples or other installations, and the response of the Canadian establishment towards them. So that has been a bit of a thorny issue as far as India and Canada are concerned. We'll wait and see if those issues are raised. But certainly, as far as some of those attacks that have taken place recently in Canada, in Australia and in UK, the Indian External Affairs Minister was very categorical in saying that these are because of domestic issues as well. They have, they do get the support of the politicians in these countries, and that is why these elements are allowed to run amok. So the Canadian Prime Minister's aircraft has landed in the national capital, and of course he's going to be escorted very quickly out of the airport as well. What is another feature as far as these arrivals are concerned is that there is this platform, as you can see, where you've got a troupe performing a classical Indian dance form, and that has been a feature that has been done as far as the entire G20 Summit arrivals are concerned. All right, even as we await Justin Trudeau deplaning at the national capital, it's time for me to take your leave. My colleague Anand Narasimhan is joining you on the right stand on the other side.